Hi, my name is Jadyn Fleischhacker, and this is my video journal for SB 360. The trip started off with a rainy drive to JFK with my parents, Peter and I. We got there a little earlier than everyone else, so we checked in at the kiosk to get the tickets for our bags. When the rest of the class arrived, we officially checked in and checked our bags all the way through to Bordeaux. This is Rachel, Jenny, Peter, and I after we checked in. We then waited in line at security for a while, but eventually we made it through. To pass some time, we walked through the different stores they had in the terminal since we had a long wait before boarding started. We also got some sandwiches and snacks because it was almost dinner time at that point. Even though we walked around, we ended up sitting and waiting for a while to start boarding. Finally, we lined up to board the plane, which also took a long time. And here we are waiting in the tunnel to board. We then took our seats and got settled in for the next 7 hours, but we had to wait for the other flights ahead of us to take off before we could depart, but we were still very excited. After a long flight with dinner and not enough sleep, we finally arrived in Paris. And here's the view from the plane right before we landed. We got off the plane and made sure we had everyone before we proceeded to the other terminal. It was hard to adapt to the time difference, so we were all very tired at the time, which is clear in this video. After this walk, we had to get through customs before getting to the gate. We boarded the flight to Bordeaux very quickly, and it was only about an hour flight from Paris. My window wasn't very clear, but that didn't matter since it was a short flight. After the flight, we all got our bags at baggage claim and waited for the bus to bring us to the hotel. After we found out the bus wasn't coming, we decided to take the tram instead of waiting for another bus to come since we were all very tired. So here we are waiting at the tram stop. Even though this isn't what we expected to happen, I think it was beneficial to take the tram so we could learn how it worked, which made it easier to get around for the remainder of the trip. This is us riding the tram through the city and passing another tram along the way. This is the part of the ride where I felt it started to look more like a European city and less modern than what we're used to. After many stops, we had to change lines to get to the hotel. Finally, we arrived at the hotel where I quickly unpacked and changed to get ready for dinner. We hopped back on the tram for a few stops and walked around Victoire to find a place to eat. After a great first dinner, Peter, Rachel, and I got some frozen yogurt and headed back to the hotel to get some rest before class in the morning. For our first full day in Bordeaux, we started off with breakfast in the hotel. For my breakfast, I had a crepe, eggs, and a croissant, and it was really good. We got on the tram to head to Kedge, and we walked the rest of the way, and here is our first time seeing the building. We started with a tour of the inside of Kedge, which I found really cool because it looked a lot different than what we're used to at Quinnipiac at home. We then had our first class, which was learning about the French wine industry, and then we had some lunch, so here's us eating in the cafeteria for the first time. After we ate, we headed to the hotel to get ready to go to the Cité du Vin, or the wine museum. When we first walked in, we saw all these different types of grapes and all their different names. I found this to be very interesting because I never realized how many different types of grapes there were and how the different color determines what kind of wine it is. This wall was huge, and I loved reading all the different names for the different types of grapes that there were. There was also this virtual grape musher where you could walk over the grapes and pretend like you were mushing them. My personal favorite part of the wine museum was this sensory table where you can smell different scents for the different types of wine, and you can figure out what each item is. You could also look at the different color classifications of wine. Finally, we finished with the wine tasting on top of the wine museum, which had a very beautiful view, and I loved the ceiling with all the glass bottles. The wine that I chose was a white wine from Bordeaux called Entrée du Mer, and I actually really enjoyed it. It was overall a really great experience, and this was personally one of my favorite parts of the trip. Afterwards, we got back on the tram and got to have some free time, so we walked around the Grand Theater stop, and I got some dinner with my friends. Afterwards, we got some dessert and walked around some more, then headed back to the hotel to get some rest before class in the morning. On our second walk to Kedge, I saw this pretty building that I didn't see yesterday. We had a full 5-hour day of wine marketing class and lunch, so I didn't take many videos, but here is us walking to the tram. After we got back to the hotel, Peter and I decided to look around the garden that was right next door. The garden was really pretty, and I loved taking pictures of the water with all the different bridges. We spent a lot of time walking around since there was great weather. We then decided to scooter around to try to see more of the city, and we found this little spot to get some lunch, so we decided to take a bit of a break. Afterwards, we decided to scooter around some more since we covered more ground than if we walked through the city, and we scooted along the water until we found the reflecting pool. Right next to it, there is a garden of flowers, which was really pretty and a great place to take pictures. When we got to the reflecting pool, it was a little too windy to take a picture, but it was still something we wanted to experience. Afterwards, we had some dinner where I got chicken stir fry, which was a little bit different than what I had the past few nights, but it was still really good. We walked around the city some more that night and then headed back to the hotel so that we could get some rest before our first visit to a chateau the next morning. For day 3, we had a chateau visit to Saint-Emilion, and this is the bus ride there. It was somewhat of a long drive, so it was hard to stay awake the whole time. As we started to get to the more agricultural part of Bordeaux, there were tons of vineyards, which was a change of pace from the city that we were used to. I decided to be in the group that did the wine tasting first, so here we are in the wine tasting room. They had a lot of wine on display that came from their vineyards, and there was also a great vibe in the room overall for the tasting. The first wine we tried, I believe, was from 2014, and the other one was from 2016. The wine tasted very different since they had different components of grapes in them. Even though I'm not the biggest fan of red wine, I still really enjoyed the wine tasting. She explained to us how they have a lot of different kinds of wines and how some of them have more of one kind of grape than others. After the wine tasting, we changed over to the chateau visit when we looked at the different vats that they had. This showed us where they keep the grapes and how they mush them, and basically the behind the scenes of storing and making Saint-Emilion wine. We also went in this room with all the barrels, and she explained how the oak barrels are very important to the taste of wine. She also explained how they make their mixtures of wine in the barrels, and that's where the different percentages of types of grapes come from. I thought the egg barrels in the back were interesting because of their shape and how their material was different than everything else that we were shown.
Very small, but it's a good vintage because we have a good maturity, concentration, so everything, but less desperation. So after this aging, every month we're gonna make the topping because we use 50% barrel of new oak, 40% barrel of one use, and 10% rest with big amphoras. So you can see it just here, and the polymer eggs. So we use it since 2017.
We got to go on the roof of the chateau afterwards, and there were these little red rocks that we pretended were grapes and mushed them while looking at the view. It was crazy to see how expansive the vineyard was and how many vines there were. It seemed like there were so many acres to the vineyard, and I felt like I could picture where they grew the different types of grapes. We had to take a bunch of pictures, so here's a picture of all the vines and another me, Peter, and Rachel. I also bought some wine afterwards to bring home for my family to try. We took the bus again to go to the Saint-Emilion village where we would walk around, have lunch, and get a tour. When we first started walking around, we saw this little bakery that made and sold fresh bread. There were so many options and they all looked really good. This was just one of the many very cute little shops that we passed along our way before lunch and our tour. The village was super cute and small and felt like we were on a movie set. It was exactly how I pictured it to be before the visit. This was our view while eating lunch, and this was the restaurant we ate at. It was a very long day beforehand, so it was really nice to get to sit down inside for a little bit. My favorite part of lunch was dessert, since it was something I had never tried before. Afterwards, we had our tour, so we had to walk back down the hill to get to where the tour started. It took a while to get down the hill with everyone since the pathway was slippery. Here's the view from the top of the tower, and you can see how small the village is and all the rolling hills behind it. The tour was honestly probably my favorite part of the whole trip to Saint-Emilion. Seeing the catacombs and the underground church is something I will never forget. Afterwards, Peter, Rachel, and I went back to the city and got some authentic croissants and bread. And here's the restaurant where we had dinner that night afterwards. It was one of the coolest restaurants I've ever seen. They had so many pictures, paintings, and LED lights and signs. It was a really cool night, and I really enjoyed the food. It was probably my favorite meal out of the whole trip, and the inside of the restaurant was something that I've never experienced before. The restaurant is very well known for their food, but also the experience that they provide when you eat there. This is us when we sat outside. Rachel, Peter, and I both got margarita pizza, and I got pesto pasta. It was really good to hit a different cuisine every night of the trip. Afterwards, we went back to the wine museum because we were meeting with the Kedge kids that night to get to know them better. After spending a few hours there, we headed back to the hotel since we had to be up early again the next day for class. And here we are on the tram on the way back home. For day 4, we had one more class left, which was our 2.5-hour French wine industry class with the wine master. This was our second class of this type, and we also had a wine tasting afterwards. We had to wait in the atrium of Kedge when we first got there because we had to be escorted to a different room. Our class today was in the wine lab because we were doing an active wine tasting after our lecture. The first half of the class was more lecture-based since we had to finish up our lesson about the French wine industry, which I found very interesting, and the second half was when we started the wine tasting, and this was our wine lab that we were in. And here is the beginning of the wine tasting.
Both Chablis to compare, okay? They're not just both Chablis, they both come, because they're Chablis, they both come 100% Chardonnay, but they also come from the same producer, being made exactly the same way. So here, the idea is to actually see to what extent it's just the land that makes a difference. Because these wines come from vineyards which are like about 5 miles away, one from another, okay? But they have the rights to different appellations. One is called Petit Chablis, which, as you can imagine from the name, is like the sort of basic level of Chablis.
This is a picture of my favorite wine from the wine tasting. After class finished, we headed back to the hotel to change since it got really hot out while we were inside. We headed back to the city where we walked around on some side streets rather than on the main streets to look at some smaller stores. We came across this fruit stand and I got a bag of cherries since it was really hot out, and Peter got a smoothie which turned out really good. It was perfect to have for such hot weather. Afterwards, we walked around some more to find some souvenirs and other places to shop. As we were walking, I saw this girl playing her violin and she was playing an American song. It was very interesting to me that even though there is such a big cultural difference between France and the United States, they still listen to and play our music. Here we are waiting to get on the boat tour after we had gone back to the hotel to change. Luckily, it had cooled off and was no longer super hot. We got on the boat and sat down to order some drinks and have some wine since it took a while to leave the dock. After the boat started moving, we headed to the top to take some pictures of the view and with our friends. It turned out to be a beautiful night. The weather was great and there weren't too many clouds blocking the sunset. We then went back inside to have appetizers and entrees. Afterwards, we went back outside to watch the sun completely set. It was such a pretty view and I love seeing the city from a different perspective than what we were used to. I think the boat tour was personally my favorite part of the whole trip. I love sunsets and getting to see it from the water and watching it set over the city was an added bonus. Seeing all the lights turn on in the city and the reflections on the water made it even better. Here are some of the pictures that I took after the sun had set after dinner. And this was the dessert that we had that night, which was really delicious as well. And finally, at the end of the night, everyone got their certificates from Kedge for finishing the course. On our fifth and final day in Bordeaux, we went on our second chateau visit. Here's a view of the vineyard, and here is what it looked like right after we got off the bus. I did forget to take video, so here are some pictures that I took. Personally, my favorite thing that we saw that day was the old house that was on the property, and I also loved looking at the difference in how modern this structure was in comparison to the picture that was just showing off the older house. After we walked around and took some pictures, we saw the dog that lived on the chateau, so we played with her for a bit, and after playing with the dog and taking a group picture, we went in the very modern structure where they keep the grapes, and it was really cool as our guide told us about the difference between the steel vats, the oak barrels, and the egg barrels that they have painted inside. After learning about the really big barrels in that big room, we went back downstairs and we looked at the smaller oak barrels where they mix their wines and keep them for the remainder of the time. And then we also did a wine tasting, so here's the room where we did that, and we tried 2 more red wines, which I actually really enjoyed. After this video, I did not take any more. I kept forgetting. So here are some pictures that I took, and after the chateau visit, we went back to the city for one more time, and we also went back to the reflecting pool and finally got a picture of the reflection. We also walked around the garden in the city for a little bit, and this is our view of the sunset on the way back to the hotel, and that was the end of our trip.